Before we begin, I need to ask you something. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and unspeakable truth, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And please, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our community of mystery seekers is located. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those slave quarters and why the truth was buried for so long. In the summer of 1856, the Caldwell estate stood like a painted illusion of southern grace just outside Savannah, Georgia. White columns rose from the red clay soil as if they had grown there naturally, wrapped in vines that suggested time, tradition, and permanence. The house overlooked acres of cotton fields stretching toward the Ogeechee River, their neat rows hiding the labor and suffering that kept them alive. To the outside world, Eleanor Caldwell was everything a Southern lady was expected to be. 32 years old, widowed, soft-spoken, and deeply religious, she was praised in church sermons and admired at social gatherings. She donated generously, hosted luncheons for missionary societies, and spoke often of kindness, order, and God's will. Her name carried respect. Her reputation was unblemished. And in her household worked a young enslaved woman named Lillian Moore. Lillian was 21, slender, strikingly beautiful in a quiet way that drew attention without effort. Her eyes were alert, always observing, always measuring. Yet to Mrs. Caldwell and her guests, Lillian was described with a single dismissive word that followed her like a shadow. Simple. "She's sweet," Eleanor would say, smiling politely, "but not very bright. Bless her heart." Lillian was assigned as Eleanor's personal attendant. She dressed her, brushed her hair, arranged the parlor, and tended to the small domestic rituals that defined the house's daily rhythm. She moved carefully, spoke little, and never met anyone's eyes for too long. To visitors, she appeared harmless, almost vacant. But what no one noticed was that Lillian never did anything with intention. The first hint that something was wrong came from a man who was not supposed to notice anything at all. Reverend Samuel Pierce, pastor of the local Methodist church, made regular visits to the Caldwell estate. He prayed with Eleanor, blessed the house, and accepted her donations with gratitude. In his private journal, later discovered years after the war, he recorded an odd observation. "Miss Moore arranges the flowers in strange groupings, always in uneven numbers, 3 roses, 5 lilies, 7 sprigs of jasmine. When I asked her why, she said only that Mrs. Caldwell preferred it so." At the time, the Reverend thought nothing of it. No one did. The Caldwell household ran with a precision that guests admired. Every book sat squarely on the shelf. Every chair was positioned just slightly inward, angled at almost but not quite the same degree. Candles were trimmed to uneven heights. Linens were folded in patterns that appeared tidy but unnecessary. Order, Eleanor called it. Lillian called it memory. What looked like obsessive neatness was something else entirely. Over years of silent observation, Lillian had built a language using the only tools she was allowed to touch: objects, angles, numbers, placement. Each flower meant something. Each position marked a moment. Each change recorded an event. The system was invisible to those who did not expect intelligence where they assumed there was none. At night, when the house emptied of guests and the lamps dimmed, Eleanor Caldwell became someone else. Her voice sharpened. Her patience vanished. The warmth she displayed in public retreated behind locked doors. Lillian saw everything. The insults whispered in the hallway, the punishments carried out where no one could hear, the fear etched into the faces of the other enslaved women. And she recorded it all. A chair moved closer to the hearth meant raised voices. A book turned spine in meant confinement. Candles cut lower than usual meant pain that left marks. The system grew more complex with time. Lillian assigned meaning to nearly everything in the house. The position of Eleanor's Bible on the bedside table, the angle of the curtains, the way shoes were aligned at the door. To Eleanor, it was proof of obedience. To Lillian, it was survival. The breakthrough, the moment the truth almost escaped, came in the fall of 1857. Thomas Caldwell Jr., Eleanor's cousin, arrived from Charleston to settle estate paperwork. 25 years old, educated, and sharp-minded, he noticed patterns where others saw cleanliness. He watched the arrangements change from day to day, yet follow rules that did not feel random. He began sketching them in a notebook, quietly, secretly. What he discovered unsettled him. These were not habits, they were calculations. The realization deepened after the sudden death of an enslaved cook named Mary Ellen. The official explanation was exhaustion. Lillian's arrangements in the days that followed told a different story, one of accusation, confinement, in silence. Thomas began to understand, and once he did, there was no turning back. Because Lillian Moore was not stupid. She was documenting crimes. And the woman everyone trusted had spent years ensuring no one would ever believe the truth unless someone finally learned how to read it. Thomas Caldwell Jr. told himself, at first, that he was imagining it, that the patterns he saw in Eleanor Caldwell's house were nothing more than the habits of a disciplined household, sharpened by a mistress who prized control above comfort. It would have been easier to dismiss what he was noticing, to fold his sketches away, to laugh at his own suspicions, to return to Charleston and forget the unsettling order of the place. But the house would not let him. Each morning he noticed subtle changes, a chair angled differently than the night before, a book reversed on the shelf where it had faced outward just hours earlier. Flowers replaced, but never randomly, always in odd numbers, always precise. Thomas tested his theory without telling anyone. One afternoon, he moved a vase an inch to the left while Lillian was out of the room. When he returned the next morning, the vase was back where it had been, and something else had changed. 2 books on the parlor shelf had switched positions. A candle had been trimmed lower than its twin. It was a response. Someone was watching the environment the way a mathematician watches a board, and the only person who touched everything in the house was Lillian. Still, Thomas hesitated. The idea that an enslaved woman, one dismissed as slow, obedient, and simple, could be orchestrating something so elaborate felt almost impossible, not because of her, but because of what it implied about everyone else. Then came the night that removed all doubt. It happened after dinner, when Eleanor had entertained 2 neighboring planters and their wives. Laughter filled the dining room. Wine flowed freely. Eleanor was charming, radiant, praised for her kindness and hospitality. Lillian served silently, eyes down, movements graceful and exact. As the guests departed, Eleanor's expression hardened. The transformation was immediate, as if a mask had been lifted. A glass had been misplaced. Eleanor noticed it instantly. She accused Lillian of carelessness, of disrespect. Her voice sharpened into something cold and dangerous. Watched from the hallway as Eleanor struck Lillian across the face. Hard. Lillian fell, catching herself on the edge of the table. She did not cry out. She did not protest. She only nodded and whispered in apology. But her eyes flicked once, just once, toward the bookshelf. The next morning, Thomas saw the record. 3 books reversed, 1 chair turned inward, a candle trimmed nearly to the base. Violence, severity, witness present. Thomas's hands shook as he sketched the arrangement. There was no longer any room for doubt. This was a language, a diary written without ink, a confession carved into space. He began reviewing his earlier notes with new clarity. Mary Ellen's death, the weeks leading up to it, the sudden confinement, the altered arrangements afterward. What Eleanor had called exhaustion had been something else entirely. Thomas barely slept. The weight of what he was discovering pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He walked the house differently now, aware that every object was a word, every angle a sentence. The walls felt crowded with things that could not speak aloud. And then the arrangements revealed something even worse. They were not limited to Eleanor. Certain configurations repeated only after visits from specific men. When Judge Harrison dined at the house, the patterns changed in a way Thomas had learned to associate with prolonged punishments. When Dr. Reeves came to inspect the estate, candles were cut low in pairs, an indicator Lillian used for injuries disguised as illness. This was not isolated cruelty. It was organized. The realization left Thomas nauseated. The very men tasked with law, medicine, and morality were implicated in the quiet language Lillian had built. He faced an impossible problem. In Georgia, the testimony of enslaved people meant nothing. Even his own word as a relative would be dismissed as family disagreement. Worse, any attempt to confront Eleanor would almost certainly result in Lillian being punished or killed. The system protected itself, and Eleanor knew it. Thomas's final confirmation came 3 nights before his departure. He woke to shouting, low, muffled voices from the back of the house. He followed the sound to the cellar door beneath the kitchen. From the darkness below came sobbing, then silence. He did not intervene. Fear rooted him in place. Cowardice, perhaps. Survival, certainly. The next morning, the arrangements told the story in horrifying clarity. No flowers. All books, spine in. Candles extinguished entirely. Someone had been locked away. Thomas packed his bags that afternoon. Before leaving, he did something reckless. He spoke to Lillian. It was just before dawn, in the kitchen, while the rest of the house slept. He did not accuse, he did not ask directly. He only said quietly, "I see the patterns." Lillian did not look surprised. She nodded once. That was all. No explanations, no pleas. But in that nod was confirmation and a warning. Thomas left the Caldwell estate carrying more than his luggage. Hidden among his papers were careful transcriptions of the coded arrangements translated into dates, events, and names. He intended to expose the truth. What he did not yet understand was how far the truth would reach, or how dangerous it would become once it started to move. And back at the estate, Lillian adjusted the house once more. Subtler now. Deeper. Sharper. Because someone had learned to read her language. And that changed everything. Thomas Caldwell Jr. made it back to Charleston in 3 days, but the distance did nothing to loosen the grip the Caldwell estate had on him. He carried the house in his mind, the angles, the candles, the quiet way objects spoke when no one else was listening. He told himself that once he put the evidence into proper words, once he translated Lillian's silent language into something respectable and legible, the horror would become manageable. It didn't. The more he wrote, the worse it became. At night, Thomas spread his notes across the desk in his rented room, pages filled with sketches of shelves, furniture placements, flower counts, and dates. Slowly, methodically, the coded language resolved into a timeline. Punishments, confinements, illnesses that coincided too neatly with moments of rage, deaths that followed weeks of silence. This was not one woman's cruelty. It was a system. And the system had witnesses who never spoke. Thomas's first instinct was to go to the authorities. That instinct died quickly. Every name that appeared in Lillian's code, judges, doctors, landowners, appeared again in Charleston society. Men who shook hands in daylight and enforced order by night. Men whose signatures carried weight. If he exposed this carelessly, the house would close ranks and Lillian would disappear. So Thomas did what frightened men often do when they lack courage for confrontation. He wrote. He compiled a full account of what he had seen, translated and confirmed. He dated every entry. He signed his name. Then he handed the packet to a friend he trusted, a printer with abolitionist sympathies, and asked him to hide it. "Not publish, not yet, just keep it safe." The printer asked one question: "What happens if they find out?" Thomas didn't answer, because back at the Caldwell estate, Eleanor had begun to sense a disturbance. She noticed it in small things, the way Lillian hesitated before adjusting the parlor, the way her eyes lingered on the shelves as if recalculating. The system had changed. Eleanor didn't know why, but she felt it. And Eleanor hated what she couldn't control. Lillian responded by becoming more careful. The patterns grew less obvious, more layered. Objects carried double meanings now. A flower count recorded an event, while the angle of its stem recorded who was present. The house had become a living document, dense and dangerous. But something else had changed too. Lillian was no longer alone. A free black carpenter named Elijah Turner worked occasionally on nearby estates. He was educated, observant, and had learned long ago that silence could be read if you knew how to look. During repairs of the Caldwell house, Elijah noticed the arrangements. Unlike others, he didn't dismiss them. He waited. When Lillian passed him a broom one afternoon, their hands brushed. She shifted the broom slightly, just enough to change its angle. Elijah saw it. That night, he tested the system by adjusting a tool in the shed. The next day, something in the kitchen responded. That was all the confirmation he needed. Elijah became a bridge. He carried interpretations from one plantation to another, recognizing variations of the same language, different objects, same principles, numbers, placement, absence. What Thomas had stumbled into by accident was something far larger. The enslaved population had built an intelligence network, not through letters, not through speech, through space, through the unnoticed movements of hands that cleaned, arranged, folded, and repaired. Evidence traveled invisibly. The first warning came when Elijah failed to arrive for work. 2 days passed, then 3. His body was found near the river, caught on branches. The official explanation was an accident. Drunkenness, perhaps. Poor footing. But Lillian's arrangements told a different story. Candles cut in pairs. Tools inverted. No flowers at all. Elijah had been silenced. The message was unmistakable. Fear spread through the quarters, thick and heavy. But fear did not stop the system. It sharpened it. The patterns evolved again, becoming harder to detect, easier to erase. Objects were moved back quickly. Meanings were split across rooms. If one part was discovered, it would say nothing alone. In the North, whispers began to circulate. Abolitionist circles received fragments, translated patterns, partial records, descriptions of methods so subtle they bordered on genius. Skepticism gave way to astonishment. Then a young journalist named Nathaniel Brooks arrived in Georgia. Officially, he was there to write about agricultural efficiency. Unofficially, he was hunting proof. He had been shown Thomas's packet. He believed it, but belief wasn't enough. He needed confirmation. At the Caldwell estate, Nathaniel noticed the same thing Thomas had. The house was speaking. Nathaniel stayed longer than planned. He watched. He learned. And when Eleanor had one of her outbursts, this time over a misplaced serving tray, Nathaniel saw the record appear the next morning, precise and undeniable. That night, hidden in the trees beyond the cotton fields, Nathaniel witnessed one of the gatherings Lillian had documented for years. Men arrived after midnight. Familiar names, familiar faces. The sounds that followed were muffled, but unmistakable. When the story broke months later, it did not name Lillian. It named patterns. It named methods. It named systems that no court could easily dismiss as fantasy. The reaction was immediate and violent. Nathaniel was arrested, his notes seized, his character attacked. But the story had already spread. And back at the Caldwell estate, Eleanor stood alone in her parlor, surrounded by objects that no longer obeyed her. She could feel it. The house was no longer hers. The morning after Nathaniel Brooks was arrested, Eleanor Caldwell awoke with the unmistakable sensation that her world had shifted while she slept. Nothing in the house appeared out of place at first glance. The floors gleamed. The furniture sat where it always had. The air smelled of polish and flowers. Yet something felt wrong. Like a room rearranged in the dark, each object returned almost, but not quite, to where it belonged. Eleanor stood in the parlor longer than usual, her eyes moving from shelf to shelf. The flowers were wrong. There were too many. 9 blossoms when there should have been 7. Her chest tightened. She called for Lillian. No answer. She rang the bell again, sharper this time. Still nothing. Panic, small but insistent, crawled up her spine. Eleanor moved through the house, her steps quickening as she checked room after room. The kitchen was empty. The quarters behind the house were silent. Lillian Moore was gone. Officially, Eleanor would later say the girl had been sold, that she had been sent west to a plantation in Alabama. There were papers prepared to support this claim, signed and stamped by men who knew better than to ask questions. But Eleanor knew the truth. Lillian had vanished because the house had betrayed her. News traveled quickly after the article appeared in northern papers. Though Nathaniel Brooks's name was discredited and his words dismissed as exaggeration, the patterns he described could not be unseen. Visitors began to look differently at well-ordered homes. Abolitionist pamphlets circulated illustrations of furniture arrangements and flower groupings, asking readers to consider what order might be hiding. The South responded with fury. Meetings were held, letters exchanged, quiet agreements reinforced, and Eleanor Caldwell became a liability. She was too visible, too connected to the story. The gathering stopped. Men who once visited freely no longer came at all. Eleanor found her invitations declined, her donations returned politely. The protection she had relied on was thinning. At night, Eleanor wandered the house alone. Without Lillian, the rooms felt hollow, unmoored. She attempted to restore order herself, rearranging books, trimming candles. But it didn't work. The system resisted her. Without understanding the language, she only made noise. Meanwhile, fragments of the truth survived. In Charleston, Thomas Caldwell learned of Lillian's disappearance. Guilt consumed him. He had uncovered the system, set events in motion, and the one who had risked everything had paid the price.
Or so he believed. Because Lillian Moore had not gone west. She had gone north. Smuggled along river routes, hidden in wagons, protected by people who understood the value of what she carried, not in her hands, but in her mind. She remembered everything. Every arrangement, every translation, every date. In Philadelphia, she sat in a quiet room and spoke for the first time about the system. Not as a servant, not as property, but as a witness. Mathematicians listened, clergymen listened, abolitionists listened. They realized something extraordinary. This was not merely testimony, it was data. Structured, cross-referenced, self-correcting, the kind of record no one could easily dismiss. Back in Georgia, Eleanor's isolation deepened. Servants avoided her gaze. The house grew colder, emptier. Without her gatherings, without her allies, she was just a woman alone with her memories, and the growing suspicion that the walls themselves remembered more than she did. One night, Eleanor knocked over a vase in her sleep. It shattered. For the first time, there was no one to record it, no one to turn it into silence. She began hearing things then. Not voices, patterns, the echo of movement where none existed, the whisper of floors settling in ways that felt deliberate. She started burning candles unevenly, obsessively, trying to undo meanings she did not understand. But the system was no longer hers to control. In the North, pamphlets appeared explaining how enslaved people had used domestic order as resistance. The public scoffed at first. Then historians noticed something troubling. Similar patterns in different states, different houses, different names. Lillian's stupid trick had never been hers alone. It was everywhere. By the time the war came, the Caldwell estate was already dying. The fields went untended. The house deteriorated. Eleanor retreated from society entirely. When she died, alone, in 1861, there was no funeral worth mentioning. Years later, during renovations after the war, workers found objects hidden inside the walls. Bundles of dried flowers tied in precise counts, notches carved into wood, a ledger of symbols no one could immediately read. But some did, and when they did, the truth expanded again, because the house had never stopped speaking. The Caldwell estate was sold quietly in 1866, a year after the war ended. No one wanted to be associated with it for long. The house carried a reputation now, one spoken in lowered voices, without detail, as if naming the truth too clearly might invite it back inside. The man who bought it was a freedman named Joseph Miller. He had worked plantations his entire life and recognized decay when he saw it, not just in wood and plaster, but in memory. He intended to tear the house down and start fresh. But the house would not release its past so easily. During renovations, workers uncovered oddities. A hollow behind the parlor wall contained a small cloth bundle of dried flowers, each set tied in careful knots. Under a stair tread, they found a thin piece of wood carved with lines, grouped, counted, deliberate. In the attic, wrapped in oilcloth, there was a crude calendar marked not with dates, but symbols. At first, the discoveries were dismissed as superstitions. Then someone noticed the consistency. Word traveled north. In Philadelphia, Lillian Moore was brought the fragments. She had aged. Her hands trembled slightly now, but her eyes were still sharp. When she saw the objects, she closed them briefly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she began to speak. The symbols matched her system, but they were not hers alone. They were redundancies, safeguards, copies. She explained that the arrangements in the house had never been the only record. They were the visible layer, the fragile one. The backups had always been hidden. In case she disappeared, in case the house burned, in case the truth needed to wait. Scholars sat with her for weeks. They reconstructed timelines, cross-referenced plantation records, matched deaths labeled natural with coded markers found in multiple homes. The scale was larger than anyone expected. The system had spread because it had to, because words could be beaten out of a person, paper could be destroyed, but order could hide in plain sight. Lillian never claimed credit. She corrected people when they called it her invention. "We learned from each other," she said. "We watched. We adapted. We remembered." In Georgia, Joseph Miller eventually stopped his renovations. He left one wall standing. Behind it, preserved, were the last untouched arrangements, objects placed decades earlier, waiting patiently to be understood. Lillian Caldwell's name faded. Her victims did not. Not fully. The records were incomplete. Justice never came in courtrooms. But something else happened instead. The lie that order meant kindness collapsed. The assumption that silence meant ignorance shattered. Historians began to ask new questions. What else had been recorded this way? What truths had been dismissed because they did not arrive on paper? Lillian Moore died quietly in 1874. No monument bears her name, but her system survived. And long after the flowers had turned to dust and the books had been rearranged 1,000 times, the truth they once held continued to move, patient, precise, and impossible to erase. By the early 1880s, the Caldwell estate had become something people avoided mentioning altogether, not because it was haunted or cursed or dangerous in any visible way, but because it represented something far more unsettling. It proved that the truth had never been absent, it had been ignored. In academic circles, fragments of what later came to be called the arrangement records began to circulate quietly. They were never treated like conventional sources, no signatures, no sworn testimony, no inked confessions, just patterns reconstructed by people who had finally learned how to look. A chair angled 2 degrees inward, 7 flowers instead of 5, candles trimmed unevenly. When scholars mapped these against plantation logs, death certificates, church burial records, and private correspondence, the alignments were undeniable. Events that had been dismissed as coincidence aligned with documented punishments, illnesses aligned with confinement, deaths aligned with sudden silence. The system had predicted the official record before the official record existed, and that terrified people. Because if this was true, if enslaved people had been documenting abuse in real time, then the idea that history simply didn't know was a lie. The knowledge had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, dismissed as orderliness, obedience, or stupidity. That word came up again and again. Stupid. That was how Eleanor Caldwell had protected herself, by encouraging others to underestimate the woman who moved silently through her house, by rewarding the illusion of emptiness, by mistaking quiet for absence of thought. And that mistake had destroyed her. Joseph Miller eventually opened part of the old estate to historians. They worked slowly, carefully, refusing to disturb anything unnecessarily. One room, left almost untouched since the 1850s, contained the clearest surviving example of the system, the parlor. The chairs were still positioned unevenly. The shelves still showed signs of deliberate rearrangement. Behind a loose baseboard, they found a thin wooden panel etched with shallow marks, tallies, symbols, and lines that corresponded perfectly with Lillian Moore's descriptions. One line, repeated several times, stood out. It marked witnesses, not victims. Witnesses. People who saw, people who survived, people who remembered. That detail unsettled researchers more than anything else, because it meant the system had never been about revenge. It had been about preservation. Back in Georgia, descendants of the men named in the northern papers fought desperately to keep records sealed. Lawsuits were filed, archives pressured, access restricted. But suppression only fueled curiosity. The more people tried to bury the story, the more it surfaced elsewhere. Other houses, other counties, other states. Different objects, same logic. The pattern was undeniable now. Enslaved people across the South had developed parallel systems of silent record-keeping, not all as sophisticated as Lillian's, but enough to confirm that what happened at the Caldwell estate was not an anomaly. It was a response to a world where speaking meant death. Ironically, Eleanor Caldwell's greatest fear had been chaos. She demanded order because she believed it reflected righteousness. She controlled every detail because control was morality. She never realized that the very thing she demanded, perfect order, was the weapon used against her. The house obeyed Lillian, not Eleanor. It remembered what Eleanor tried to erase. And when the truth finally began to surface, it did so without shouting, without spectacle. No single trial, no moment of justice. Just a slow, irreversible unraveling of the lie. By the end of the century, the phrase "stupid trick" appeared in abolitionist memoirs, not as insult, but as bitter irony. A reminder that what powerful people dismiss as foolish is often what they are most afraid of understanding.
Because intelligence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arranges flowers. Sometimes it moves chairs. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes, years later, it finally forces a reckoning. Long after the Caldwell estate fell into quiet disrepair, long after the flowers had rotted and the shelves had been emptied, the system endured, not in wood or stone, but in understanding. By the time historians fully grasped what Lillian Moore and others like her had done, the people responsible were beyond reach. Eleanor Caldwell was dead. The men who had protected her were dead. The courts that might have acted had been reshaped by war, reconstruction, and forgetting. Justice, in the legal sense, never arrived. But truth did, and it arrived intact. In archives across the North, documents labeled domestic observations were quietly reclassified. What had once been dismissed as obsessive neatness or servant routine was re-examined with care. When scholars compared multiple estates, they noticed something chilling. The same logic appeared again and again. Different houses, different objects, the same silent grammar. It became clear that the system had never depended on one woman or one house. It depended on underestimation, on the belief that intelligence required permission, on the certainty that silence meant nothing was happening. That belief had been wrong. The system worked because it did not look dangerous. It looked obedient. It looked harmless. It looked stupid. And that was its genius. The truth Eleanor Caldwell worked so hard to bury survived not because someone shouted it, but because someone arranged it carefully enough to last. Years later, when Joseph Miller was asked why he left one wall of the Caldwell house standing, he answered simply, because it already said what needed saying. Behind that wall, the final fragment of the system remained untouched. It contained no names, no accusations, only a sequence, objects placed in careful relation, recording a final truth, that what is hidden in plain sight often survives the longest. That power rarely recognizes resistance when it doesn't look like rebellion. And that history does not only belong to those who write, it belongs to those who find ways to remember. Lillian Moore never stood in a courtroom. She never signed a statement. She never accused her mistress aloud. Yet she exposed more than any testimony ever could. She turned obedience into evidence. She turned silence into record. She turned a so-called stupid trick into a truth that outlived everyone who tried to erase it. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. That the system worked, that it had to, that it proves how much of history survived, not because it was allowed, but because someone refused to let it disappear. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next.